I feel like for most of us, you do so much work, so many different projects that we get burnout and either leave the field or we just take on less projects. But I think now with, talking about the police brutality, talking about some of these more quote unquote taboo topics, I feel like it is re-energizing a lot of this. And I think it is starting to bring more people into it because they're just so mad. And I think for this to become more mainstream, our planning teams, our leadership need to reflect the community. You cannot go into a Spanish-speaking community and not have someone on your team who speaks Spanish. You cannot go into a community of color and have a completely white team. And I think that is the next step that we really need. We need more of us. We need us on every single team. The community needs to see themselves in their leadership, in their communities, and in those people who are making all of these decisions.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WGBH Forum Network. I'm Bob Seay with WGBH News. And this is our third transit-oriented development talk presented by WGBH Forum Network and MassINC. And this morning, the title of our program is It Takes a Village to Make a City, Why We Need Equity in Urban Planning. We're going to talk about traditional planning, what has gone wrong with it, and a new method of planning known as community-centric planning. And that's going to be our topic for the next hour. But since we are talking about planning and land use, I think it's appropriate that we begin with a moment of silence this morning. We would like to take a moment of silence to acknowledge that the state of Massachusetts has been developed on the unceded occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. We honor and respect the many Native peoples who are connected to this place, past, present, and future. As we begin this morning, we'd like to get an idea who is out there in the audience. So we have the first of what will be 3 poll questions. You see it on the screen now. The first, outside of your everyday job, have you ever participated in a public planning process? What race do you identify as, and what is your age group? If you would answer that for us, give us an idea of who we're speaking with this morning. Our speakers this morning, Tracy Corley, MassINC's Transit-Oriented Development Fellow, who has organized this series and done a great job. Great to see you again, Tracy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Monica Tibbits-Nutt is the Executive Director of the 128 Business Council and is the Vice President of the nonprofit YEP, or YEP, standing for Youth Engagement Planning, which brings urban planning and community advocacy into K-12 environments. And if you're a fan of the MBTA's Fiscal Management Control Board, you know Monica very well. Leah Bamberger is the Director of Sustainability for the City of Providence, and she previously managed the City of Boston citywide sustainability initiative called Greenovate Boston. And Pol Tavares is an activist who organizes for housing justice and also is Operations Director for the Providence Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. We welcome you all this morning to our program. Let's begin by talking about traditional planning and the harm that that has caused. Tracy, do you want to begin?
Sure, Bob. It's interesting, that, as we talk about, what is traditional planning, planning has been a field that it seems that it's kind of evolved, ever since its first inception. And so to kind of really identify what traditional planning is really difficult to kind of really pinpoint. But, I think that as we kind of think about what planning has traditionally been, it has been really focused on specific geographies. And we talk about this a little bit in our report on equity and transit-oriented development, in which we can actually provide the link for our attendees to actually go check out the report itself. But in the report, we talk about the fact that, we tend to think about, what area or what space are we going to be planning, whether that be the district level, the city level, or the regional level. And so what we propose in our report is to actually, whatever geography you're working with, you always overlay it with focus on the community. And so historically, planning has been about, and I have to admit, I was trained as an architect, and we used to joke that, we architects had big head syndrome. It's a very ego-driven profession of where, you you get these technical tools and think that, hey, my vision of what, the world should be is, is the way that we should actually design spaces in our cities. But, that does have a lot of faults with it, in that, to think that, one particular person or a small group of people can actually make the decisions for an entire community, especially something that's always evolving like a city, is just smacks of hubris. And so far, I think that in a lot of our planning, we've had a lot of hegemony that has actually been there, that has been driven by, let's just be very direct about it, a very white, male-centered culture. And so if we can go to the next slide, I kind of, as I've been talking to more and more communities about what new planning and what community-centric planning really looks like, it's really more about making sure that instead of in the traditional process where, a city or a developer or a group of elites would kind of come up with a vision and then kind of start a very linear planning process. And then at points along the way would actually kind of engage the community, maybe early in the process, maybe late in the process, maybe it's just a public meeting, maybe there's just a couple of exercises that they offer to the community. And at the end, they actually publish their recommendations, and then they decide how to implement it. As we think about community-centric planning, it's less about engaging the community and more about empowering the people who live in communities. And it's the city as well as the community together, if not just the community leading the visioning process. And then there are a series of steps to decide what gets done and how things get implemented. And the community isn't consulted as a part of the process, but they're an integral part of the process, if not leading it. And then also, there's also a feedback process. Once you actually create a plan, it's not something that just kind of sits on a shelf or you just kind of go through the steps and implement it. It's not a linear, let's just get this project done kind of process. It's really about constantly interrogating, is this really working for our community? And then as the community changes, what needs to change? And so you're always going through that process. And so traditional planning, just to summarize, looks at, the city or the agency that's kind of orchestrating the process. They're acting as an administrator, whereas what you really want to see is the city or agency acting as a facilitator and letting the community decide what vision gets created and implemented.
The poll results, 78% said they have been involved in a public planning process, 19% no. We have 89% of our participants this morning identify themselves as white, 6% as black. And the age group, we have 61% age 25 to 49, 8% 18 to 24, and 31% 50 plus. So that gives us an idea of who is participating with us this morning. I'd like to ask any of our panelists if they can give any examples maybe of planning that has gone wrong.
I feel like there are a significant amount of planning projects that have gone wrong, so it's incredibly hard to pick a particular one. But I would say I focus a lot on transportation. So from a transportation standpoint, I would say we've had many projects that either didn't address the actual core issue that the community had, or it was something that the community was actively opposed to. And I'm not just talking, when I say the community, I'm not just talking the people that have time to come to our public meetings or have, the connections to engage their elected officials. I'm talking about the community as a whole. And I think transportation, as we all know, has done a significant amount of damage in the nation. And I would say the problem with that is, as Tracy said, it's very, very consistent how planning has gone. And I think with transportation, often the community engagement is a checkbox. And it's at different points of the project, but there's no feedback loop back. There's no constant conversation. There is no checks and balances of the work that we're doing. And so I would say when you look at the United States, a lot of the more recent highway projects, a lot of the more recent bike ped stuff being centered in specific communities, there are a number of different things. And Tracy really highlighted how all of these problems are created and the changes that we need to make to build those better projects.
Yeah, you might judge from the graphic behind me, there might not have been a lot of community input into the to the highway construction in this poor community. Does anyone else have an example they'd like to talk about? That's an example of how planning went wrong.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think
Okay.
to the image behind you. In fact, I suspect there was a lot of community input. It just wasn't listened to. It was actually systemically ignored. And that's how we get that sort of outcome. And I think to this process of like who owns the vision is really important. And I think what we haven't done a good job in planning is making space for multiple visions, right? It's not just anytime you have one vision, it's going to be that of those who are in power, and those historically have been white men. So shifting that is really important to make space for a variety of visions that come from community. And I think we set ourselves up for failure when we look at planning as a linear process with a beginning and an end. And then once we're done planning, we move into implementation. I see more and more planning as an important part of democracy, right? It's a part that community must own in order to really hold their own future. So I think it's an ongoing process, and planning in itself is an outcome, not just a means to an end.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in before we move on to the next subject?
Yeah, just in my own community right here in Providence in the South Side, I live in Mashapal Commons, and it's the ancestral home of the Narragansett peoples in Providence. And, we've experienced a process, or they've experienced a process in the 60s and 70s that displaced them and ruined their way of life and really destroyed what they were doing here. And so I think when I think about planning, I think about recognizing that the plan is meant to benefit someone. And if the benefit isn't experienced by a broad spectrum of the community and just people in general, that just creates a cascade of issues like outside of the plan. And so we have to recognize the power that has.
So how do we change things, or how are things changing to heal some of that harmful process?
Well, I think, I think what we're seeing, especially right now in this moment, kind of given what's going on with COVID-19 and a lot of the conversation that's protesting police brutality, as well as a lot of the other kind of issues associated with systemic racism, is that we're actually seeing people really speaking up and really kind of demanding to be a part of planning in their communities. And I think that has been really influential in kind of what's happening in the planning community. I think that also planners of color, who have typically not been very at the forefront of the industry. We also don't see a lot of planners of color kind of coming through the education system. There's been much more deliberate processes to actually make sure that not only are people of color and minorities and those who've been historically marginalized or excluded, that they are going through formal planning training, but also that organizations like Monica's and cities like Leah's are actually out there providing community members with the skills and knowledge that they need in order to be able to plan their own communities. And so I think that, like I say, planning is a very evolving profession and field. But I think that, as we talk about, some of the systemic issues, we know that we can't use the exact same processes that created the issues to correct the issues. And so I think that there is a lot of experimentation that's happening right now, but there is also, there are a number of very proven practices. And a lot of that does involve kind of really better engaging people and taking people's lived experiences as expertise. And that is something that we also need to be much more aware of, that we can't just use quantitative data in order to be able to kind of plan our cities. We need to be able to really talk to people and actually take their experiences as truth, just as much as the data.
So when a developer has a plan and they bring it into a governmental, quote, planning office or a regulatory organization, I guess the process by which that plan is considered is absolutely critical. So how has that been done, and how is that to be changed?
I mean, I think it talks about, it really reflects where you're working. I would say in Massachusetts, whenever we have a developer, which I work with a lot of developers who put together an initial project, usually it's something to respond to what the market is asking for, to respond to what they've been hearing from potential tenants, potential residents, and then they build this project. And what we see they do is they end up not necessarily going to the planning department, they end up going before either their city council, their board of select people. And what that becomes is they take the plan and then the community, and a very small minority of the community, decides what they actually want built. They request this through our special permit process, which many of us that work here have been involved in. And developers have to keep changing these projects and keep responding to the things that are being requested. And oftentimes it's our very antiquated zoning laws within Massachusetts that are dictating what these projects have to look like. And then you have the typical community engagement meetings, which you have a very, very, very small subset of a lot of the community. And quite honestly, the people that tend to be engaged and tend to take that time are the people who don't want to see projects built. There are people who don't want to see their communities change. And I think that is where you end up with these developments that don't actually address any of the equity issues, don't actually address the housing needs. And so I think most of the time developers are painted in this negative light, except developers are providing what they're being told to do so that they can actually build the projects.
Annabelle has raised an interesting question. She says, could someone speak to the planning language as a barrier to engage communities of color? And this may go back to the whole zoning regulations. I mean, how do you break through that to make sure that people understand what is going on?
Well, I can somewhat address that. I think what I've learned from our experience, the climate justice plan, and really striving towards a community-centered planning process, is that there's a whole lot of learning that has to happen both inside government and within the community so we can come to the table together and do this work. And one of the sort of guiding tenets that we use is this spectrum of community engagement, from community engagement to community ownership. I think we have a visual for that as well, if we could pull that up. But it's really about this shift in capacity that needs to happen. And I experienced it in my role in government that when we started our planning process, community was leading. The REJC was leading that process, and they designed the process and they executed that process. And it was very uncomfortable for me because it really it was unlike anything I've ever seen, any process I had ever run, any process that I learned about in planning school. And I had to really trust that the community knew what they were doing. And I'm embarrassed to say that that was a challenge, right? But I learned and I grew through that process. And I think the result for me was that just recognizing that we really need, if we want different outcomes, which I think universally we do, we actually have to really upend the processes that we've been relying on to get the results that we've had. And that is a lot easier said than done from my experience. But I am proud to say that we I think did a pretty good job of that. But it is, for the language, it's about, learning how we need to talk about things differently, we need to approach things differently. And I think changing the language is one of actually the easier parts of the puzzle.
I want to jump in.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that, we as policy and planning professionals, as facilitators of planning process, as opposed to, the designers, I guess you can say, it is our job to be able to translate. And so as we talk to people who are living in communities, they really understand what it is that they need, but they might not have the vocabulary to articulate it. And I think that, Leah, what, your team has done, as well as what other communities have done, by using tools and techniques that aren't necessarily verbal, or bringing in, like, for example, I think this might be a good point to show the slide from New Bedford. The city of New Bedford, they did a very bottom-up planning process for putting together the New Bedford Resilient Plan, which is all about climate resiliency citywide. Instead of going out and, kind of putting together your traditional like blueprints and, of what they thought should happen, they actually created interactive activities. I think they did 25 different events around the city, including a family community day, where people actually got an opportunity to kind of come out and really talk about what they wanted to see in the city. And also in their meetings, instead of using English as the default language, they allowed groups of folks, because they have a large Guatemalan community that works in the fishing industry there in New Bedford, which I think the city of New Bedford is still the largest seafood processing location in the country. They actually have the communities kind of work through this process in their own native language. And since about 70% of us are visual first, they used a lot of visual tools in order to be able to communicate and have people communicate what that vision is. And then instead of the city kind of, then kind of just taking that input and then creating the plan, what they did was they kind of leveraged that whole process and allowed the community to shape the plan, but then translated it into a way that it can be communicated more broadly. And so what you see here, I put this little chart up here with these little green dots because they kind of like looked at all of these different dimensions, really kind of keeping in mind what it was that the community wanted, and actually gave things a score as to whether or not they were actually contributing to, whether each action that they had planned to do was actually contributing to or actually harming some of the key goals that they wanted to actually achieve. And so, I think that translation process, I think that if planners start thinking about themselves more as translators as opposed to designers, then I think that will then kind of help us kind of get over some of those language barriers.
Absolutely. I really want to chime in here. Thank you for Tracy for that. Thank you for the experiences from Newark. That actually is inspirational. I think in our plot process here in Providence with the Climate Justice Plan, we really took that similar approach and really trying to get, rather than asking the complex questions or the measurements that folks in the environmental, the climate world are used to, like vehicle miles traveled and particulate matter. We didn't ask folks about these things. We really just asked them, how do you get around town? How do you stay warm in the winter, cool in the summer? And is there something making you sick? And that's really what we built our plan on. And then we added the more technical terms for, those folks who are planners and who are in this world. We had to do the translation from the community to the planners and the cities and the decision makers. And ideally we like to get to a world where our communities are the decision makers and not, folks who don't even live in our communities. So I think, that I really appreciate the metaphor of like translating these things, because it's so important for any plan to be successful, in my opinion, needs to be accessible to everyone involved. And I think that's one of the key things. So I appreciate the person who brought up the question around language, because that, it, like Leah's saying, it is something that's easy to fix, but it's oftentimes the first thing that people are turned away from when seeing a plan is really that institutionalized language around what this really is, and if we let folks know that it's really about what's going to happen on your street, or what's going to happen in your neighborhood, or what your children will experience on their way to school, all these things are, and like the environment becomes relevant when we talk about the land, air, and water, and not carbon emissions and volatile organic compounds. Like these things are not accessible.
Great point. Good time to bring in our second poll question. Do you think your community does a good job of making planning processes accessible to all residents in your community? We'd like you to weigh in on that one. This also, I think, brings up the whole issue of storytelling, which is another way that I know some of you have been using to try to get at what people's experiences are. So who could talk a little bit more about that process of storytelling and having people envision what they would like to see in their communities?
I think just building off of Paul's last point about translation, right? And one of the challenges we faced in our process is the REJC, the Racial Environmental Justice Committee, did such a great job engaging the community, asking those very simple questions, hearing them, getting their issues and concerns and priorities. And then we did some work to really connect that to policy. How do we address that? And then we had to go back to community to say, here's how we're addressing it through these wonky policies and programs that they might not see the connection to their priorities and concerns. So the REJC developed these future stories, and there's a series of them on our website, which we can share the link to. But they are community voices telling their stories of how Providence would change if we implement the climate justice plan. And I think we have one queued up here to share with you as an example.
Buenos dias. Thanks for coming for a tour of the Providence Port Green Justice Zone. I'm a member of the Port Green Justice Zone Council. We're a group of residents that makes decisions with the city to detoxify the port while improving health outcomes of our community. Our mission is to create an environmentally friendly port of Providence and a greener, healthier neighborhood. I've been involved with environmental justice for about 2 decades at this point, but I come to this work as a mother, taking my babies to the emergency room over and over again because of pollution from the port. When I learned the port is one of the dirtiest parts of Providence, it made sense. You can see the huge tanks across from the Big Blue Bug on 95. Why is all that being stored here? Why are they allowed to trade in hazardous chemicals that are proven toxic for the land, water, and air? When I understood how their business and profit was directly linked to the harm of my family's health, I had to do something. I started organizing with folks in Washington Park, and we created the WP Green Justice Zone. Over the years, we got city leaders to clean up the port and to focus new investments in areas that have been historically neglected. It may not surprise you, but after some research, the South Side was identified as an area that wasn't getting the same attention as other parts of the city. The Green Justice Zone makes sure that the money to green Providence doesn't end up just making the nice parts nicer for folks who already have the cleanest air, land, and water in the city. It also ensures we have a seat at the table so we don't get pushed out when our neighborhood gets cleaned up. This parcel of land is now in a land trust. That means the community owns the land. Community members who live in Washington Park decided together to build this affordable housing with solar panels on the roof. We bought the first solar panels with funds that we raised from the community and foundations. Now the community owns this solar array. We each pay a subscription fee to get this clean energy, and we sell any excess energy to National Grid. We're hoping to extend the array to more rooftops, especially in the port. That'll allow more folks to have control over their energy and health. Oh, there's Kemi. She's out there installing the last of the panels. She grew up in Washington Park. She was one of the young people that were paid to train doing green work. She started when she was 16 doing installation. Now I think she's 22. She's our chief electrical coordinator. She helped organize a co-op of electricians, and we subcontract them to do all the work on our system. The majority have gone through the program. Despite all of our progress, you can see over here that the port is still polluting. The Green Justice Zone has been a force to reduce pollution. Diesel engines are being replaced with cleaner and more efficient electric ones. Companies are now required to report what's been brought in, brought out, processed, or stored here. There's also talk of a new fee on hazardous imports, and we're already starting to see less hazardous waste come in.
What a great story. And it begins with people asking very simple questions, like, why does this exist? Why do we have to live with this around us when it's kind of assumed, I guess, well, that's the way things are. So it shows the power of people expressing themselves, and it's very inspiring. So this is an example, right, of a new way of trying to develop change and planning process.
Yeah, and as you kind of listen to the story, I mean, I just absolutely love kind of hearing people's stories. That's actually, you know, a core of a lot of the research that I've done is just going out and listening to people's stories, because there's just so much information that you can actually glean from like listening to people's stories. You know, I mean, you can go out and, you know, you can conduct surveys, but you don't really kind of hear the emotion about the impact that, you know, storing hazardous chemicals in the city is having, you know, and the way that people kind of think about that, or the pain that, you know, a mother is having to constantly drive her children to the emergency room. You know, those are the things you get in stories that you just can't get from surveys, unless you are, you know, asking every question under the sun, but nobody wants to take that survey because it'll take you all day to do it. So you know, so I think that, you know, it just shows the power that's there, and I think that the more stories we listen to, the more we will be able to glean much better information as to, you know, how we can better be translators for doing better planning in our communities.
Do we have the results of that second poll question? There we go. Do you think your community does a good job of making planning processes accessible to all residents? Just 20% said yes, and an overwhelming majority, 57%, said no, 23% not sure. Even when you make these processes available to the community and they come up with their stories and their reactions and their plans, you need a responsive government or somebody who's going to be responsive to what is being said to move the whole thing forward, right? And is that a big problem? How does that get changed?
You know, it's kind of interesting that, you know, from my point of view, I work primarily with the gateway cities, which are our smaller cities here in Massachusetts. You know, I know that, you know, larger cities often have, you know, challenges with just the layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy that's there. And as we saw in the New Bedford slide, you know, they're a smaller city, and they recognize that, you know, the folks there can kind of come together and kind of get out of the way of the people in order to be able to kind of make the planning process happen. I have to say that New Bedford isn't the only gateway city that's out there doing this kind of work. You know, I think about last year we did a forum in Lynn, and it was very interesting because I didn't realize just how deep the division was between kind of like the city and the developers and the people who live there. And so, you know, we were having our event, we had probably roughly about 60 or 70 protesters come in because they were very unhappy with the development that was going up and what they perceived as being a, you know, a destruction of their local community by this this very prominent development going up in downtown Lynn. And I remember at the end of the protest, I was like, you know, I really appreciate you guys coming here and protesting, but next year I really want to see you guys here on the panel. I want to see you guys at the table kind of leading this discussion. And I have to say, I'm excited to report that, you know, CHAPA has been leading a municipal engagement initiative, and they've actually brought together those same, a lot of the people who were there protesting at our event were there in a conversation to help develop Lynn's new housing production plan. And so they're at the table, the labor unions are at the table. It's all being kind of facilitated by CHAPA, but it's really the community saying, hey, this is what we want to see in our community. We've got all the advocates there, we've got developers at the table, representatives from the city at the table. Everyone is sitting down thinking, what kind of housing do we need in Lynn? And how can we kind of help build this relationship? And so, and I see that across our gateway cities, that you do have the nimbleness and the flexibility to quickly pivot and actually change your planning processes. But, you know, in some of the gateway cities, you know, I think that the will is just much more strong than others. I think also Salem has done a really great job of kind of reaching out across the city with their Imagine Salem process and making sure that they're taking the planning process to where people are, not requiring that people come to the public meetings, but actually going into the neighborhoods and really talking to people and hearing their stories. So I think that, you know, either the city as a whole or the departments that are there, the will has to be there, but also you have to make sure that you have the nimbleness to be able to kind of move the bureaucracy out of the way and let the people take the control.
Monica, you have a good example of how youth can be engaged and empowered in this process. Why don't you tell us about that?
So with Youth Engagement Planning, this is a nonprofit organization that brings planners and educators together to address a lot of the issues that we've had in the traditional planning process. And the way we do that is we actually start with the youth. We work with students as young as 5 years old. We come into their communities, we come into their community centers, their after school programs, and we talk to them about their communities. We talk to them about the things they like, the things that they want to see in the neighborhood, the problems that they see. We ask them about the things that their parents complain about, their grandparents, and we start there. And what we do is we take them through a number of activities that are really centered kind of in the planning process. They just don't think of it that way. We will have them draw a map of the neighborhood. We will have them draw what they think a park should look like. We'll ask them, well, what would you like to see more of? Do you want to see more bike lanes? Do you want to see more grocery stores? And that really just kind of gets their imaginations going. And we learn so much from them because they see things that we don't see. And they're not thinking about the politics of a project. They're not thinking about the cost. They're not thinking about any of these other mechanisms that I think really hold up the planning process. And through that, not only are we learning the way that they speak, they are learning the way that we speak. And through that, it really moves through that translation. It gives us that common language. And through that, we reach their parents. And through that, we reach their teachers. And we have a video that we brought that illustrates this a little bit more.
So YEP is here in New Orleans doing a one-of-a-kind event with the American Planning Association, APA, in partnership with their National Planning Conference, their annual conference that is all over the country. And YEP had a great idea of partnering with the APA organization to put on a youth engagement activity, a workshop of 4 hours with over 100 students from the Boys and Girls Club of Southeastern Louisiana. And we are so excited to have this partnership and to teach kids about urban planning, and then to also teach our planners how to include youth in their planning process. And so this has never been seen before, and we are so excited to have this event here in Louisiana.
Youth take everything that they've learned in this environment and they take it home. They tell older siblings, they tell their parents, they tell their grandparents, they tell the other people in their lives about what they learned. And the kind of unexpected outcome that comes from that is they are now more engaged. The parents and the other adults in their lives see that this is something that was important to their child. This is something that their child got excited about, excited enough to come home and tell them about. And it starts to make them kind of a little more curious and them wonder a little bit more. So then they start looking through some of the materials that their kids have brought home, and it makes them much more likely to go to that community meeting, much more likely to fill out that survey, much more likely to engage in a way that can kind of be a heavy lift for a lot of adults. Not everyone has time to go to night meetings or go to public hearings in the middle of the day. And so by giving them that in through their child, giving them that vocabulary that contextualizes a lot of the things that they're seeing either on flyers or seeing in their mailers or seeing on town websites, and gives them an in to start communicating in a much more meaningful way.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Monica. The great thing about children is they usually speak the truth. So you can find out a lot of things from kids that adults will never tell you. So I think it's a great technique. We did have a question here from one of our viewers. Michael Ciano says, are there best practices for planning along the waterfront when, in addition to concerns surrounding equity, inclusion, and access, the impacts of climate change like sea level rise are at play? And certainly for those of us here in Boston and in the Providence area, that's a big issue. Leah, do you have a response to that?
So we are acutely focused on our port, as you saw in that future story we shared. It is currently, the Providence waterfront has an industrial section that is immediately adjacent to a predominantly low-income community of color. And so and it's also just south of, so not protected by our hurricane barrier. So really a recipe for disaster. And, you know, we're thinking about how we can, at the same time, I really do think it's an opportunity because we know that area needs to be transformed, right? And how do we transform it in a way to address equity, to address a green economy, to address rising sea levels and storms. So I think as you embark on that change, I think it is a huge opportunity to think about all of those things. So you're not just isolating one part of the challenge, because we do know they are so interconnected. So we're already seeing that change. There was less than a year ago, there historically has been literally a giant pile of coal on the port. And the last of that was removed to make way for a staging area for offshore wind farm that was developed off of Block Island. So that's a beautiful part of that transition that's beginning to happen. But we're also thinking about how we can increase access to the waterfront for those neighborhoods adjacent to that who currently are very close to the water, but have no access to that. So all of these shifts, I think, are not at odds with each other if you are thinking about it holistically. And the best way to do that is to listen to the community, of course.
Another question from our participants, Anne says, developers seldom have plans, they have projects. The planning should have set the vision, values, and goals before the project is created. But places in Massachusetts don't want to plan because it, quote, locks them in. We don't require zoning to match the master plan. And I think zoning is the 800-pound gorilla in the room here, because no matter what you may want to do or the community wants to do, it may butt up against what is permitted or not permitted. So how do you take on the issue of zoning? And any one of you can respond to this if you'd like.
I think you nailed it on the head, that it is not, zoning is not reflecting what these master plans are actually saying. I think for a lot of these communities, for their master plans, they actually do really good community engagement because they are based in the community. But they take that, they take those concerns, they take what they think is a vision for the type of community that the residents want, and then they create no process by which to actually make that a reality. Whether it's the zoning, whether it's the review process of the city, whether it's, you know, when engineers are coming in, and whether there's actually checkbacks to that is what creates this problem. We've gotten locked into this, and no one seems to think that there can be any other way to do it. But if you're not linking the plans from the community to the mechanisms to actually react to that and build the community they want, it makes all of this impossible, even if they are really good projects and really good plans.
So how do you break through that?
Folks used to say, there's that bumper sticker that says pavement is permanent or pavement is forever. And I'm like, that's a lie. There's jackhammers. And so, you have to be willing to take a jackhammer to your zoning. I mean, you really have to be okay with kind of sweeping it aside and recognizing that all of the hard work you put into your plan, you can actually implement based upon that. I think right now in this pandemic, we're seeing the ill effects of having single-use zoned areas. We think about like the businesses in downtown Boston right now who are heavily dependent on the single-use, financial district and all the office buildings around kind of, government center. And they probably aren't going to be there whenever, things do fully reopen, because there's not enough diversity in those communities and in those neighborhoods to be able to support those businesses. And we think about, like living in these residential neighborhoods, none of the restaurants or any of the businesses here are hurting at all because they're so overrun, because folks, are just, they want to be close to home. And if you have that option, the whole single-use neighborhood conversation, I think, is something that we should be thinking a little bit more about, and thinking about, is zoning actually really serving us? I think that unless it is something that is truly poisoning people, then we should actually have a little bit more flexibility in how we think about planning and operating our cities and communities. So, take a jackhammer to it is my first suggestion. But if not, then kind of start, yes, literally break it apart. If not, then start like really chipping away at it. But I think this also kind of ties into, what Anne had also asked another question about, how, like, given the constraints that a lot of agencies have, as well as what their missions and obligations are, and how do you do this work whenever you feel that you might not be able to deliver, on what the people are asking for. I think that this is a great time that if you have a really great comprehensive plan in place, or the community has put together a really great plan, then you can actually, that's a great time to do public-private partnerships with developers, with the private sector. Because it's not the government's job to really deliver everything. If you switch your role from administrator to facilitator, you're just there to actually help do in the translation process. And so, and I think that I actually heard that directly from New Bedford, that they actually in their process, by switching that up, it saved them so much money because they didn't actually have to actually go out and implement and be in charge of kind of like providing money to actually make these things happen, because the community was already engaged and willing to kind of find the resources to do what they needed to do. And I think that that's where, if we think about, just kind of chipping away what's already there, if not just breaking it apart, we can get a little bit more creative about how we actually develop our cities.
Time for our, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to add to that. So
Sure.
And we actually do require that zoning aligns with our comprehensive plan. So when we released the climate justice plan last fall, we actually had a development that was proposed in the Port of Providence, a waste transfer station. It's the exact type of development that the climate justice plan is all about shifting away from. It would increase truck traffic, it was unwanted land use, and another one in this neighborhood that already has so much. And through a nuance in the zoning, a loophole, we were basically able to deny that project, but we know the next one's coming. And so we are trying to think about how do we institutionalize this plan, this climate justice plan. And I think, that's actually where we're going to, that's really the test, right? So we have a great community-centered plan. How do we actually codify it? So we're thinking about how to use it to update our comprehensive plan. Once that's updated, then we can update our zoning and make changes to reflect that. And that will really be a test for our community, because the system right now is accustomed to and really designed for the folks who have access to power, who have the resources, who know the processes, the developers, the people with the resources, the money, right? And that will be, we did a lot of work to try to ensure that the climate justice plan was centered around our frontline communities. That meant telling traditional stakeholders that they didn't have a seat at this table. That message wasn't received well, as you can imagine, but we worked really hard to protect that space so we could ensure that the vision was of frontline communities. And now we're taking it to the next step, and it's that sort of targeted universalism approach that we see over and over again. If you start with these, or if you don't start with frontline communities, with those who are most marginalized, their voices continue to be left out. And that's where we're at right now, trying to really institutionalize this work.
The third poll question, we want to slip this in before we run out of time, and it does relate to this. Do you feel that you have an opportunity to have your voice heard whenever local planning happens? You can see the options there. Yes, I know how to make my voice heard. No, my city or community does planning, but I don't know how to make my voice heard. And no, I am not even aware of local planning efforts. So those are the three choices. Please weigh in and we'll let people know what you think. It seems to me that this is a real transformation in planning that's taking place. Is this a relatively recent phenomenon for those of you who had, have been involved in this for quite a while, or is this something that's been kind of bubbling under the surface and is finally coming to the fore? Because it seems like in past years, like you say, there have been people who are involved in the process who kind of know how to get what they want, and the community has been left out. So this is quite a challenge to bring the community into it.
I think you are starting to see a difference more mainstream, but I think for those planners of color, for these advocacy groups, we've been doing this work for a very, very long time. It's just either our voices are silenced or there just aren't enough of us. I feel like for most of us, you do so much work, so many different projects that we get burnout and either leave the field or we just take on less projects. But I think now, with talking about the police brutality, talking about some of these more quote unquote taboo topics, I feel like it is re-energizing a lot of us. And I think it is starting to bring more people into it because they're just so mad. And I think for this to become more mainstream, our planning teams, our leadership need to reflect the community. You cannot go into a Spanish-speaking community and not have someone on your team who speaks Spanish. You cannot go into a community of color and have a completely white team. And I think that is the next step that we really need. We need more of us. We need us on every single team. The community needs to see themselves in their leadership, in their communities, and in those people who are making all of these decisions. And I feel like everyone's talking about kind of the opportunity we're in right now. I hate to say that a pandemic is an opportunity, but I will say with all of these protests, all of these new policy conversations we're having, it's a call to action. And it's not a call to action to the public, it's a call to action to our profession and to our elected officials and to those groups who have been very resistant to any change within their community. Now is the time for us to make these better decisions because we need to rebuild what our society looks like. Let's actually rebuild the society that works for everyone and that is welcoming of everyone's opinions and everyone's different stories and different lived experiences.
You know, you were speaking of the pandemic we're in and how we're all communicating with each other virtually so often. And one of the questions we had that was submitted before our program was, have you seen recent successes in virtual community engagement, especially in trying to get the diversity of participants? Is there a way to use this technology to kind of further the effort? Any thoughts about that? Since we all can't be in a room, is there a way? Do people not have the technology they need to do this? Is that a whole other challenge that we face?
Yeah, I think, you know, the REJC recently went through a process, or we're like in the middle of a process, really, part of our city's capital improvement plan. You know, we've received $1 million split between 2 neighborhoods to, you know, $500,000. And the charge was to do a community process where we're asking, you know, what do you want to see? What could we potentially do with the money? And having a conversation back and forth, you know, not the easiest process to do during a pandemic, but, you know, we're figuring out that it's not much different from a regular meeting, although, you know, the people who show up to that meeting will have the access to the internet and a computer. So that's, you know, that is a class barrier we have to be real with. But there are ways to broaden that accessibility by, you know, just providing stipends for folks or doing, you know, a survey of just, you know, our local networks and figuring out who actually wants to attend and what can we do to provide that access, you know. So it means buying laptops for folks. It means, you know, setting up internet access at their homes. You know, maybe not for the full year, maybe, you know, just provide a month because that's what's in the budget. But there are ways that we can make virtual work for as many people as possible. But we just have to keep in mind that the needs aren't on the programmatic side. The needs are on the attendance. You know, that's where our focus should be. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have, go ahead,
Yeah,
Tracy.
I just want to encourage people also to not forget about phone. I know as many Zoom calls as we do, you know, phones still work. And so, you know, I think that you can do asynchronous kind of engagement opportunities where people can kind of do things on their own time. You know, direct mail also works. The Postal Service is still here, fortunately. And so, you know, you can actually reach out to people with information and materials via post. It definitely is much more costly than doing a Zoom community meeting, and it takes a little bit more coordination and effort. But there are ways that you can do community engagement without having internet connectivity. It's just that we have to be ready and willing and creative about how we actually put those tools and resources into place.
Mm-hmm. Because I've heard another barrier to the public meeting is childcare. Another barrier is maybe not having food. Maybe, you know, those types of simple things can make a big difference as to whether people can participate or not. And of course, if they do have internet access and can attend virtually, that circumvents that. Do we have, we just have 5 minutes left. Let's get to our poll results from the third question. Now, we do have a substantial majority of our participants say, yes, they do know how to make their voice heard or participate in local planning. No, 22%, 6% weren't even aware of local planning efforts. So that's encouraging in terms of people knowing that they can make their voices heard, at least. But as we wrap up here this morning, what are the final messages all of you have for our participants in terms of where the planning process is going, how we can make it better, and how we can engage the community more in what's happening? Do you want to start, Tracy, or anyone can start?
I'm going to pass it. I want to hear what our guests have to say
Okay.
first, because I have a lot of things I could say, but I don't want to consume all the time.
Okay, Monica or Leah?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge to us, building off of what Paul said. It is really hard to do community engagement under normal circumstances, and now we're having to get a little bit more creative. And that's the stuff I want us to focus on. Focusing on how are we actually engaging people? How are we meeting them within their communities in a way that is safe for them and safe for us? If you think about how much money each of these projects spend on community engagement, or how much money they spend on flying people places or hotels, we now have a ton of money that we can use on getting tablets and working with local businesses that are essential, whether it's the grocery store, whether it's a doctor's office, and really meeting them and trying to find these different ways. Calling people, I love that. I'm a big fan of phone. Calling people, using the postal service. We need to start doing this, because I think out of this challenge, we are going to have better tools. We're going to have much more diverse tools. And I think we're going to have a much better relationship with the community, because they knew that we worked that hard to try and meet them where they were, to make sure that we're addressing their needs now, but then also addressing the needs that they're going to have long term, whether it's 10 or 15, 20 years from now.
Okay, thank you. Monica, who's next? Leah or Paul?
I'm happy to weigh in, because I think that, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is because whenever we talk about, any policy area, we talk about, who does it benefit, who has the power, and who has the control. And I really appreciate, having Leah on the call today, because in that example, that was a very clear example of doing the hard work to actually say, hey, we're not just going to bring you into our process. We're going to hand you the keys and let you decide how to drive. Mm-hmm. That is something we need to see more of, to actually recognize that people know what's best for them, and to give them more autonomy, more power, and control over how their communities are. Because I love that quote that says, no one should ever have to move to live in a better neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Keeping communities together, keeping communities intact, because communities, cities, places are all about the people. But in order to make sure that the communities work for everybody, we need to be willing to give up power and control.
It's interesting. Displacement is how we began the conversation this morning, observing where we live and who lived here before us. Paul, I see you nodding your head in agreement.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that often comes up in conversations around community engagement and environment is the sense of urgency that everyone's all of a sudden feeling around climate change. But the thing we go back to, and why we're often, we suggest slowing down, is because our communities have been feeling that sense of urgency for hundreds of years now. It's been around for a really long time for us who are at the front lines of environmental racism. And we're saying slow down because if we're not included in the plan's going to be a repeat of the last 100 or so years.
Great points made by everyone this morning, and it's an exciting opportunity. It's also very challenging, but so vital to where we're all going in the future in our communities. In this time of, as Monica said, the pandemic is a terrible thing, but as we realize, it represents opportunities, and it's taking advantage of those that's really important. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists this morning. We want to thank Tracy Corley for organizing this whole series, which has been fascinating. Tracy, great to have you here. Pol Tavares from Providence. Leah, also Leah Bamberger from Providence and formerly of Boston. And Monica Tibbits-Nutt, always great to see you. And you always have so many important things to say. It's wonderful to have that opportunity to hear you this morning. And our thanks to MassINC and the WGBH Forum Network, Annie and Lauren Joe and everybody who has contributed to making this possible. And as you can see, we'd like you to take our survey and sign up for the MassINC Challenge. And also, we hope you will join us in future TOD talks, as we call them, dealing with transit-oriented development and how it affects the lives we live. So thank you, everyone, for participating this morning. And if your question was not answered, we do have copies of those questions, and we will endeavor to answer them at some point for you, even though you may not have heard an answer here this morning. We want to thank all our participants and our guests and invite you to join us next time. Thank you.